I am writing this always, the haiku epiphany of Issa's Dewdrop World and Ray Armantrout's Anchor. On the May 20th, 2010 broadcast of the National Public Radio program On Point, radio host Tom Ashbrook interviews Ray Armantrout on the occasion of her winning the 2010 Pulitzer Prize for her poetry collection, Versed. Ashbrook begins the interview with a remark upon the similarities he sees between Armantrout's poetry and that of haiku. Although Armantrout allows the haiku and the logic of Zen koans served as formative poetic influences for her in her college years, especially the poetry of the haiku poet Basho, she ultimately denies this comparison. Despite this, Ashbrook's observation is not particularly a unique one. It's significant that this comparison of Ray Armantrout's work to haiku continues to arise despite her dismissal of it. On first glance, it may seem that this comes from the visual characteristics in her poems, the brief 3 to 4 word couplets and tercets that dominate her poetry. On the other hand, it can seem like the narrative and autobiographical compression and fragmentation in her work is also, in many ways, similar to that of haiku. As a consequence of the brevity of Japanese poetry, the 31-syllable waka, or tanka poem of the Japanese royal court, and the layered development of the haiku, the autobiographical setting and circumstances are often at best indefinite and unclear, despite the poem seeming to be an account of a lived experience. Along similar lines, Ray Armantrout contends that she doesn't choose to foreground, quote, the autobiographical content of her poetry, even as she concedes that, quote, a lot of what's in my poems is really what's around me. So for neither the visual element nor the narrative, if these are the most salient properties that define the two, I would instead argue that there is a rhetorical movement in her poetry that leads to a final moment of clarity and evanescence, what could be called a haiku epiphany, what Kenneth Yasuda, quoted in Richard Wright's Haiku, This Other World, calls the oddness that is the intent of all haiku and the discipline of the form. This haiku epiphany is an emotionally charged but rhetorically complicated statement that can lead to a new conception of the world, but a conception of ambiguity and often incomprehension rather than stability and certainty. An epiphany often grounded in the haiku in a specifically Buddhist conception of the world as beautiful and evanescent. But for Armantrout, however, there is not the awe of religion, but instead a nearly religious awe in the face of scientific fact, intruding upon our conventional experience of reality that seems to be the engine for the haiku epiphany. And I'm seeking here to compare these two epiphanies and trace this sense of the haiku epiphany in her work. And for this, I first want to analyze a haiku by the poet Issa, written in the 19th century, translated by Gary Snyder in his book Danger on Peaks. This dewdrop world is but a dewdrop world, and yet, page 102. Upon the first reading of this haiku, it's possible that can seem completely abstracted and reductive to the point of it almost being meaningless. There is the sense that there is a dewdrop world. The world is like a drop of dew, and then there's there's reassertion that this world is a dewdrop world, or but a dewdrop world. That's only a dewdrop world. And then there's that final yet. There is that vacillation and uncertainty in that final yet. and also a sense of the ephemerality of the world. But where can we take this statement from here? As Taisetsu Uno explains in River of Fire, River of Water, in discussing classical Japanese poetry, one of the favorite metaphors for impermanence, flux, and change was dewdrops. It signifies the fragile, fleeting nature of human life. An early example from this period is the following poem by Kino Tomonori. What good is life? Is it really nothing more substantial than the drying dew? I would exchange it without regret for just one night with her I love. Page 33. So this dewdrop world, it's something very small and impermanent, like a drop of dew on the grass that evaporates in the morning sun. But at the same time, there's a sense that this world is affirmed because it's so small and insubstantial. Even though it's as unimportant as a dewdrop, there is also a resistance that the idea that the world is just a dewdrop. There is that last phrase, and yet. There's that phrase hovering in the air, an objection left unvoiced, a half-whispered disagreement that nonetheless threatens the original premise of the poem, that perhaps the world isn't just a dewdrop world at all, that despite this world being only a drop of dew, there is something else to it, something that makes it important to us and gives it value, or perhaps the world's fragility and importance is precisely what makes it precious and gives it meaning. A further understanding of this sentiment unfolds when the autobiographical circumstances of Issa's life are brought to bear upon this poem. Robert Hess recounts the circumstances of Issa and his young wife, Kiku, and their children in The Essential Haiku. A son was born in 1816 that survived a month. A second son was born and died the following year. A daughter, Sato, lived just over a year and died of smallpox. It was just after this death that Issa wrote his major prose work, A Year of My Life, page 148. In this haibun work, alternating between short diary accounts and haiku, Issa narrates the birth and development of his daughter Sato, culminating in the devastating details of her death. She grew weaker, and finally, on the 21st of June, as the morning glories were just closing their flowers, she closed her eyes forever. Her mother embraced the cold body and cried bitterly. For myself, I knew well it was no use to cry, that water once flown past the bridge does not return, and blossoms that are scattered are gone, beyond recall. Yet try as I would, I simply could not cut the binding cord of human love. Essential Haiku, page 218. So understanding that this poem, that the world is just a drop of dew, is not just a religious sentiment that is quoting the Zen sentiment, but it's actually being said upon the death of his child, that the fragility of all existence and that this world